Welcome to a special edition of Neon Galactic, a project we're calling the Rethink. I'm James Falk. Thanks for joining us. A modest exploration of the topics that drive this show and the broader dialogue involving anomalous phenomenon, UAPs, UFOs, and potentially non-human intelligence will drive anyone to the realization that it's quite clearly time for a rethink. We as a species need to rethink our place in the universe, on our planet, in our own heads, and amid the broader spectrums of life and consciousness. Enter Neon Galactic. My co-host, Dr. Chris Avis, and I have had several conversations now about the state of this research, both in the hard sciences and in the humanities, as well as the state of this diverse and at times temperamental community as we all fight for more truth, curiosity, acceptance, and disclosure across the board. An earlier Neon Galactic interview with Professor James Madden, who is here today, and author-experiencer Matthew Roberts proved to both Chris and I that there is significant value to be gained from bringing aspects of this field together that normally don't intersect, to build bridges, quell conflict, foster dialogue, and find those commonalities that can unite us all into a concerted movement, even though we're obviously a disparate and often cantankerous lot. The Rethink was born out of those conversations, and we set about to contact and invite the best minds available from the various corners of this field. Scientists, humanists, experiencers, podcasters, journalists, and political activists. Each of these roles holds a vital piece in the broader mosaic we're hoping to help build, one that includes the power and strength of each perspective while remaining united under the collective banner of open-minded research, dialogue, and disclosure of truth, however weird or somber it may actually be. Author and philosophy professor James Madden, physics professor Kevin Knuth, political strategist Lester Nare, and experiencer J. Christopher King of Ontocalypse Productions and the Experiencer Group. These are the best and brightest, and this is the conversation I've been dying to have since first falling into this topic. I have questions. Chris has questions. We'll also be taking occasional questions from the live chat, in addition to whatever inquiries our guests might make of one another. We're going to keep it constructive and seek out ways to work and grow toward our ultimate goal of treating this subject and its followers with due respect. Please, if you're watching this and appreciating the value of these conversations and this approach, like and share this video, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. We are just getting started on this subject here at Keat TV. More will be coming. Show other mainstream media outlets and network affiliates that covering this subject is worth their effort and airtime. My co-host today for the Rethink is Dr. Chris Avis from Camosun College in British Columbia. Do you have any opening remarks, Dr. Avis?
Yeah, thank you for having me on. So I'm a instructor at Camosun College here with a background in physics and astronomy and climate science. And I've had a long-held interest in the phenomenon, but it didn't really seem totally real to me until this past year, kind of as a result of two factors. One was in part doing some therapy work with a program of psychedelic-assisted therapy, which really helped to open my mind and physically experiencing some different aspects to reality. And the second was to actually see folks like David Grush, David Fravor, and Ryan Graves out there testifying in front of Congress and seeing the Schumer Amendment come out, which really kind of suddenly made all of this very real to me. And since then, I've been kind of avidly going down the rabbit hole and exploring all of the different avenues of the topic and many of the themes that are explored on this show. So I really appreciate Neon Galactic because I think James has brought forward not only people who are extremely sharp intellectually, but also really good moral human beings. And I think it's something we desperately need right now. So I feel like in this moment where our kind of consensus reality, even in an ordinary political sense, is breaking down along with some faith in our institutions, I'm hopeful that explorations of a topic like this is something that can really unify us as a people. And I'm hoping that we on this panel can model optimistic, hopeful, and positive dialogue and a way forward for this. So really honored and excited to be involved with all of you. Thank you. And I'll mention that I'm going to be handling some of the chat moderation here where possible. We will be trying to bring in questions from the chat where we can, but we were really hoping to have a smooth conversation. So we'll be looking for questions that seem thematically related and have hooks for all of the presenters there. So please don't take any offense if we don't quite get to your question here, but we welcome you to throw them in. And yeah, hoping for a great, respectful dialogue. Thank you.
All right, Chris, that was fantastic. Kevin, let's start with you. If you could give a brief introduction of yourself and sort of talk about, I mean, it's the perennial question in this space. How did you get into the subject? But for people who may not know you or know your story, let's give it to them anyway.
Right. Thank you very much for having me. I'm Professor Kevin Knuth from the physics department at the University at Albany here in New York. I'd always been interested in UFOs ever since I was a kid. I grew up during the moon launches and moon landings, and grew up watching In Search of with Leonard Nimoy and things like this. And so I loved learning about UFOs. And and I think that what really struck me is when I went to graduate school, I moved to Montana, Bozeman, Montana, at Montana State University. And our first 2 weeks there, there was a cattle mutilation, actually 2 cattle mutilations on one ranch one night, with many UFO sightings that night. The sheriff's department was swamped with UFO sightings. And so this was all over the news. And we graduate students were trying to figure out what's going on here, what kind of crazy place have we all just moved to. And we disturbed another physics professor who then came and talked to us a bit about this, and then mentioned that he had friends up at Malmstrom Air Force Base, and they were having problems there with UFOs flying over the ICBM missile sites and shutting down our nuclear missiles. And we listened politely, but afterwards we just kind of laughed it off because it just didn't seem real that you could have UFOs shutting down our nuclear weapons and nobody's doing anything about it. You know, nobody's on alert, right? And so I never took it very seriously until years later. It was probably about 2015. I was teaching an astronomy course and going to talk about astrobiology, and I had several students who wanted me to talk about the possibility of aliens visiting Earth. So I was just poking around on the internet the night before my lecture, and I stumbled on Robert Hastings' 2010 press conference, where he had people like Robert Salas and others on from Malmstrom Air Force Base, the same Air Force Base, talking about UFOs shutting down nuclear missiles. And it really sank in. The reality of the situation sank in, that this is actually real. This has been going on since the 60s at least, and nobody's doing anything about it because nobody believes it. And it just struck me as a very dangerous situation, because we're dealing with an unknown and we're just ignoring it. And so I've been interested ever since that. And then it was only 2 years later that the New York Times article came out about the ATIP program. So I decided to I thought scientists need to study this, and I should do it. And that's how I got involved.
Well, thank you for that, and God bless the fact that you did get involved, because you're definitely a leader in this space. Professor James Madden from Benedictine University, can you talk a little bit about how you got in this space and your research thus far, and just introduce yourself?
Yeah, so my name's Jim Madden. I teach at Benedictine College in Kansas, and I was not really interested in the UFO as like a matter of scholarly concern until really the first time I really took it seriously was after the New York Times articles came out 2017, like so many people, right? And then when that whole thing started to build, and the kind of the podcast space started to break out a little more, and I'm hearing more stuff, I kind of read my way into the problem, right? So whereas like Kevin comes at it through a very empirical way, like I came at it in through scholarship, right? So I start reading Vallée, right? I start reading John Keel. I start to see there does seem to be at least what these authors are claiming to be a fairly good body of evidence supporting that there's a there, right? But it's not like what philosophers do to get into that, right? So, but it was good enough, I thought, that I could take it as a given that there's a there. And it seemed that there was actually some very interesting thought out there about this that might do well to have a little more influence from the Western philosophical tradition, which is what I do. Okay. And so then it became like literally, a scholarly project for me to bring those tools of philosophical scholarship to bear in it. Right. And the next thing I know, partly because of the bidding of Kelly Chase, I wrote a book on it and put that out there. And so here I am now. Right. even 2, 3 years ago, if you said, "Hey, you're gonna become an author, known author on the UFO show," I would have said, "Oh, there's no way. That's not what I do." There's no there, and it's all changed very quickly for me. Yeah.
I appreciate that, and there's a lot there that I want to dive into. That's the title.
Oh, hey, one thing. Can I mention one thing?
Yeah, go ahead.
I was so glad Kevin mentioned "In Search of," right? Because one, it dates us both, uh, and two, "In Search of" just scared the crap out of me when I was a little kid. So I'm like, you were braver about it apparently than I was. So anyway, thank you, Kevin.
Well, speaking of J. Christopher King, can you give us your introduction and how you came to be associated with this topic? Obviously, for you, it's I don't know if it's a choice, really, right? I mean, yeah, give us your background.
Yeah, thank you, James. I really appreciate that, and I appreciate being here and with such a wonderful group of people. Yes, I am the director of the Experiencer Group, which is a unique, private, pay what you wish member site dedicated to support, curiosity, and community for those who have lived through anomalous events of any and all kinds. I started that with Stuart Davis and Kirsten Blackburn, really in the early days of the pandemic. And we kind of formalized the site and put that together at the beginning of 2021. However, I had my own anomalous experiences starting, gosh, when I was about 4 years old. The first one happened that I can recall, conscious memory, and um, and yeah, I lived in a series of houses when I was a kid. I moved around a lot when I was a kid, and lived in two homes that would be what people consider to be haunted, like haunted phenomena, and later had experiences that are more closely associated with UAP phenomena and non-human intelligence. And that kind of opened the door of inquiry for me. Um, and as you said, not necessarily what I was looking for, but when things happen that young as children, we're in a very tabula rasa state. So it just became kind of like my landscape for what the world or the nature of reality really was, which was I I then discovered was profoundly different or than some folks, and for some reason needed to be hidden or wasn't to be talked about in polite society. And I thought that that was strange. And I also recognize that when we watch TV and movies, that it's one of the most popular things to consider. So, what was that schism about? That really kind of animated a lot of my consciousness and a lot of my thought through my childhood and into my adult years. And so here I am in my 40s, and I still feel exactly the same about that, and still find mystery and curiosity within the phenomenon. Along those lines, I have this group where we meet. There's support group situations in there, ask me anythings, lots of situations for experiencers to get together privately and compare notes and kind of learn from each other, have conversation and grow. I also co-founded a conference series in New York where we've had speakers, wonderful speakers like Christopher Mellon, Gary Nolan, Sharon Hewitt-Rowlett, Mitch Horowitz, Leslie Kane, Ralph Blumenthal, many other figures in the field, bringing them together for unique opportunities, intimate opportunities for people to ask questions and have exchanges with some of the deepest thinkers in the field. From that, I started a production company with Kelly Chase and Jordan Flowers called Ontocalypse Productions, a neologism of Kelly's. And two of the projects that we've recently worked on, one was actually James Madden's book, Unidentified Flying Hyperobject, which a project that Kelly, as James put it, initiated with him. And we're also currently working on a docuseries that we independently are producing with independent finance help from some investors called The Beyond: UFOs and a New Reality. We're about 80%, 90% of the way through production and post-production, and we're looking forward to putting that out later this year.
Excellent. And I did get a glimpse of that at Contact in the Desert. It was not finished, it's in progress, but I was blown away by the breadth of information that you guys provide, and you don't cut corners. A lot of times in this space, it's simpler to focus on an aspect, but I think you guys really tried to get a global snapshot, and I appreciated that and think people are going to love your documentary. So thank you for that. And Lester, thank you for joining us. I don't want to put the other guys to shame or anything, but I'm most excited about having you here because you are, not most, but I'm really excited to have you here because you're right in the middle of the political battle that's going on, and you are keeping chart of it for a lot of folks who are following you on X and elsewhere as you sort of help educate them on what's happening and what needs to happen in order for there to be success. So if you could talk a little bit about how you got into the space, and after that I have some follow-up questions, and I think we'll be coming back to you a lot to sort of get your read on how all of this affects politics.
No, absolutely, and real pleasure to be here. And I've been a big fan of many of the members on the panel prior to this. For just by way of background, growing up as a Zimbabwean American in New Jersey, as a soccer player, the number one thing I remember as a kid is driving to and from the fields to train with my dad. But one of the few memories I have that wasn't soccer related, that I think was the entry point for me being interested in the subject, was we used to fly model planes and model rockets all the time. And so I always had this sort of general curiosity about space, about flight, just conceptually. The second sort of, I think, turning point was I had a very mundane sighting in 2012 when I was just in the middle of college. And it was an orb kind of situation, very erratic flight behaviors. But at the time, I didn't really have a framework for what kind of box to put it in, and sort of chalked it up to, oh, that was weird, and didn't really think much about it. That began to change as during this time period, I was active in the political space, mostly as a volunteer, doing fundraising and just being engaged in the political discourse. 2015, we saw the WikiLeaks sort of dumps come out, and as a part of that, there were some related communications, around this concept of disclosure, or that there was in fact these materials in possession of the U.S. government. And that sort of got my, spidey senses tingling a little bit, because, now there's this idea that, okay, well, we're now potentially seeing there being a desire to move this issue forward in the political conversation. Obviously, like many, once 2017 happened, and in between that time, much like most, read every book I could find and tried to sort of ground myself in. There's been a lot of people who've done a lot of great work and research in this space over the last several decades. So, for me, coming from the millennial generation and entering the space, I do get to stand on the shoulders of many giants in that context. 2017 happens, and you look at the news coverage and just the general independent media coverage, as we then saw legislation coming forward in 2019, 2020, and onwards. I just felt that, as a consumer of media, there was not a channel that was speaking to, I think, the breadth and depth and palace intrigue about what was actually happening within Congress related to the subject, which was a wholly new phenomenon and had not been something that had existed before. But there were very few, not only people on the beat, but also trying to do analysis and think about, is this time now for a political movement around this, or at least political advocacy to begin, given we have legislation to work with. Now cue up the UAP Disclosure Act, which was proposed last year by Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, along with several other co-sponsors in the Senate, and passed unanimously. Looking around left and right, there was no one, again, creating that advocacy infrastructure that is commonplace and we see in many other industries. And myself, coming from a tech background as a co-founder and COO of a real estate technology company, and continuing the long history we have of real estate entrepreneurs being involved in the topic with the likes of Robert Bigelow and Brandon Fugel, I felt like it was time to, I had a skill set that I could build something. And we ended up launching UAPcaucus.com in the summer of last year with the goal of providing on-ramps for the public to understand better where we are in the political conversation, and then provide sort of links out to the historical context, to the large, again, corpus of information, research, and analysis that's been done over the last several decades. And from there, now we're in a position where we've been able to collaborate with many of both the academic side of the equation, as well as sort of the understanding part of the equation, both with providing our own white papers, helping to build out the digital infrastructure for other platforms and websites, and looking at this as how do we continue to professionalize the space in a way that we can, again, bring more people into the tent who are going to be coming from a variety of different angles, only one of which happens to be the government disclosure conversation.
Yeah. Thank you, Lester, for that. And I'm going to sort of try and frame this conversation from a step back here as we hopefully dive into the meat of it. Let's talk about fault lines, right? Like, this is a very complicated issue, and there are lots of people who are passionately involved, and they come from everywhere. There's people on the left, people on the right, people who are skeptical, people who are full-on believers of, all kinds of things. And no judgment from me on any of that, but there's, constructs where it's the Pleiadians, or it's constructs where there's people are interdimensional, or the visitors are interdimensional. There's all kinds of ways that people can land on this topic trying to find explanations. But at the same time that we're this disparate group and we're made up of all these complexities, we're trying to get particularly a few things done, right? Like, we're trying to get the government to open up its information about that. We're trying to get science to accept it as a serious topic and to not poo-poo it from a distance without taking a substantive look. How do we take all of these threads and make it into a movement? I mean, is it okay to call it a movement? When I was talking with Lester a couple days ago before the show, we were like, we need to think about this, or at least somebody needs to think about this, like a legislative or political campaign. We have objectives that we're trying to accomplish, and we're trying to get those done. And the problem is that we, like I said, we come from all over, left, right, center, up, down, middle, all around. So I guess from your guys' perspective, I'd like to hear what you think we can do to better cohere as an organization, and from your various silos. We have the scientist, a humanist, an experiencer, a political strategist. What, from your perspective, is the best approach, or how can we make progress, I guess? And let's start with you, Kevin, on that, and we'll just kind of do the circuit again, if you guys don't mind.
No, thank you. No, that's an excellent question, and it's a difficult one. It's hard for me to imagine how to pull all of these threads together. As a physicist, I've been mostly interested in the science aspects of it. I've often felt that once scientists get involved, there's no stopping it. Scientists are always interested in, in studying things, and once they realize that this is a serious thing to study and that there's some real mysteries here and some real discoveries to be made, I think it'll be unstoppable. And I'm starting to see that from, other research groups around the world where we're talking to each other, working together, sharing information, doing exactly what needs to be done. And science is typically very good at that, and I'm heartened to see that. And the fact that there are scientists from around the world dealing with this and now looking at this means that no one government's in control of anything. You can't have one government shutting down this group of scientists and stopping the whole process. That isn't going to happen anymore. So I think that that's now changing. Every time we put out another research paper, publish another scientific paper in a scientific journal on this topic, more scientists get involved. I get emails from at least one scientist every 2 weeks telling me that they read my paper and they find this fascinating and they want to know how they can get involved. And this is now happening more and more. And I think that so from a scientific perspective, that things are changing there. How to pull it together, I don't quite see how. But maybe discussions like this are a great start.
I appreciate that, and I also see the value of what you were saying about scientific discovery. If something major comes out of a scientific analysis of materials, say, or whatever else, and it becomes incontrovertibly not of this earth, then all of a sudden I think that does help broaden the conversation, hopefully all around. Professor Madden, do you have any thoughts on the question?
Yeah, I'll admit that that's not a question I've thought a whole lot about, but maybe I should, right? And I've really not seen myself as like part of a movement, right? I've seen myself as like there's some questions, and I've done my best to answer them. I publish the work, I talk to people about it, and I allow, other people like Lester and Jay, involved in media to think about like what this amounts to in terms of big picture movement kind of things, right? Because I do worry that if I came to think of myself as part of a movement and thereby like committed to some kind of like end social goal,
Mm-hmm.
there's a way of like hamstringing your own intellectual freedom that way,
Sure.
right? Because now I'm part of a thing, right? And that thing's going somewhere. I want to keep being a part of that thing,
Yeah.
right? And so now, does that make me unable to change my mind, right? Does that make me, because now I'm part of this thing that's bigger than me and I'm contributed to and I'm dependent on. So I wouldn't say resistant, but my first move is not to think of myself as part of a movement. My first move is to think of myself as just trying to do some intellectual work and then just throwing it out there and seeing if it sticks with anyone and if it helps anyone, and then moving on to the next target, right?
Yeah.
I think though it's different for someone like Jay who's working more directly in media, someone like Lester who's is working on the political side of it, and even someone like Kevin who's like as a scientist you got to think grants, you got to think how like you're not doing your research from an armchair, right? You don't just need a book and 2 hours to think, right? So I think for that sort of work, they all have to think of this in much bigger terms, right? Whereas for like a humanities scholar, I just need the leisure to think about stuff.
Yeah, I see what you're saying there, but there have been lots of movements throughout history where the movements were so, I mean, I can't say that like I can define what this movement necessarily would be, but the general movement toward increased curiosity and not throwing out, what things possibly could be because we have prejudices based on materialist notions or whatever. That's, I guess, more of a mind-opening kind of argument rather than like actual, political movement. But I see what you're saying. Jay, you are sort of a leader on this aspect, I would say, in terms of bringing people together and helping to define the people that you work with in more positive light and give them, I think, a little bit of strength in standing up for themselves and they're telling their stories because they feel like they're, hopefully part of something that's bigger than they are by themselves. But enough of me babbling. Can you talk a little bit about this question and what you think we can do to help cohere and get people to open their eyes and minds about things that they may not be comfortable with?
Yeah, well, I appreciate those kind words, and I appreciate what Kevin and James said already. Two very brilliant minds on this topic. I do think that it's an incredibly important question that you're asking, and I think that it's significant that we're on a PBS production talking about this question in terms of it being, always supported by viewers like you, right? I think that grassroots efforts and really like looking at this from a grassroots level and people that are passionate, I think that growing it up from that level is incredibly important. I don't think that we can necessarily wait. We've been waiting for so many decades for one particular, government body or, kind of this many-headed government body to come out with information. But as we all know, one particular body doesn't have a lock on kind of the nature of reality. Reality doesn't exist like that. Human experience and, living experience in general doesn't work like that. So in my mind, one of the most important things that can happen in terms of coherence is to think of things in terms of interpersonal disclosure as well. Mm-hmm. One of the most important things that we can do is figure out ways to be open within the private circles that we have, whether it's family, whether it's your loved ones, your friends, close friends, colleagues. People have to have discernment. It's not something you can jump up on your desk, Dead Poet Society style, and proclaim, in the morning at the office or something like that. We all recognize that. And at the same time, there's a lot to be said for just the authenticity and honesty of personal history and experience and what that can do in terms of intimacy and in terms of togetherness. And, you know, it's it's strange that we've worked ourselves into a position as a society and as a culture that that version of honesty, just being open about these weird things that actually happen and have happened, amongst, all cultures seemingly in the world throughout centuries, why is that version of honesty so subversive? I think partially, it's an open question and I don't want to answer it myself, but, I think part of it is that we've been told that we're not supposed to talk about this. And I think that that's fundamentally wrong. So, from just the perspective of being open with each other and having better relationships with each other, deeper relationships with each other, on even just that grassroots level, we can talk about these experiences. And if you haven't had these experiences, maybe you can think back over the years and think about the friend that told you about this before, and maybe you weren't in a position to listen. Maybe you weren't in a position to hear that. And just to consider, like, what if that happened again? Like, what would you do differently? How would you listen differently? I think that that's one thing that we could do.
That's very important. I thank you, and thank you for saying that. I have a couple of follow-up questions, but let's get around to Lester here. Lester, I mean, I guess you are at the center of what we would be calling the movement in terms of trying to get it through Congress and getting some institutional changes made. But also, I think that you do see where a lot of the, sort of diverse opinion and whatnot can cause problems politically to get things done. For instance, you have an ally in Congress who is a red Republican who might alienate people who are, Democrats, yet they are the most vociferous and vocal supporters of legislation. It gets very complicated trying to build a caucus for this kind of issue. Can you talk a little bit about what those complexities are and how maybe we should think about it when we are moving into that political sphere?
There's so much good fodder already. It's like I could talk for hours, not only about the responses, but that question. I think I understand the question. I want to quickly touch on Jay's point, which I think is really important, that the answer to your question in part is these personal conversations. So as an example, for myself, in my own network, I'm a, Princeton alum. And so I have a very quote unquote highly intellectual group of friends who can sometimes be extremely dismissive of the subject, right, as a general foundation. But what I've found is as I've been out and having a public face, the amount of people in my network that have now come forward and been like, oh, by the way, XYZ, whether they've, been interested in it, but were uncomfortable saying it, or they had a family member. But the ability to have those personal conversations, I think, is really valuable because the trust that you have with people can help break down the stigma barriers that have for so long been an issue here. In the political conversation, the dynamics are extremely complex because we're in one of the most tumultuous times in terms of we now have situations where, because of algorithmic feeds that are where we get the majority of our information, we're receding further and further into our own individual realities with no crossover. And the UAP subject happens to kind of be one of those things that does have crossover, sort of religiously, demographically, politically. So it is one of these bridges. It has been a challenge to, especially in an election year, to see the UFO UAP subject be primarily bi or nonpartisan since it's become popular in the 2020-21 time period, but has now shifted, and you're seeing some of those vocal proponents leaning back into their normal political corners of, oh, it's Biden's fault, or, oh, it's, X, Y, or Z. So that has been a huge challenge. And one of the things we try to do is continue to have our communication with staffers in order to ensure that we keep it grounded into like the aspects that are not about pointing fingers one way or the other. And I think if we just take a quick step back, the framework I've tried to approach with this to understand kind of how all of our lanes interact is it's like a 3-lane highway, and you have capital D disclosure, or what I like to call consensus, as one lane of that highway, which is using these institutions that people trust that run our society. They have allegedly some information. So there's the ability to get that data that then could then provide potentially increased access to funding or just legitimacy to the scientific discovery process. So that's that second lane. So you have disclosure as lane 1, you have discovery as lane 2, and then the bridge between those two is funding. As government increases access to data, it legitimizes the topic, increasing funding from National Science Foundation, NIH, to the discovery lane. As the discovery lane makes fundamental discoveries, that then increases the ability for members in Congress to have a lower political cost to supporting the issue. The third lane is an interesting one, which is that understanding. And this is where you have experiencers or the humanities who are not, again, necessarily as oriented around objectives like we are in the sciences or in the political conversation, but they're having some of the most, I think, robust, expansive, and creative ways of thinking about the circumstances. And that can inform how we communicate both amongst in the scientific and sort of public sector. So all I'm trying to sort of say is that's kind of how I think about the lanes very loosely. And the idea is there's a couple of bridges that we can find. Part of it's information, part of it's capital. The other example I'll bring with the understanding is with experiencers, the subject is so abstract that when you go talk to members of Congress about it, that there's nothing that grounds them in like, why do I need to deal with this today? If anyone happened to see the Havana Syndrome hearings in the Senate, it was a very, emotional is maybe a little bit of a strong term, but you could see that the members were connecting with the narrative and the story that was being told. And a big reason why was because it had veterans, identifiable people that had served the country that were not getting the support they needed in their recovery to exposure to anomalous health incidents. That's something that I think we can do in our conversations, which is involve more of the stories of real people, particularly folks who happen to be former government in the government conversation. And so those are just, I think, like just some fodder around where the overlaps are. And there's certainly plenty more, but I do appreciate, the idea that for both in the humanities and that hard sciences, you kind of have to be heads down a little bit, right? And it's sort of a bottom-up approach where they're going from first principles, figuring out what happens, and then it has implications upstream.
Yeah.
In our conversation, we have to go top down, which doesn't give us as much freedom of movement because we can't just decide to do something without getting the systems to be conducive to that. So that's just kind of how I think about it.
I think that that's beautiful, and it sort of underlines where each of us is important in this overall process. Whether or not we're fighting for the political change that we think we may need, or we're fueling the conversation to keep people excited so that they end up wanting to have those conversations. Either way, we're all moving toward this, I think, ultimate goal of just honesty and truth and figuring out what our reality is like, which seems like is the fundamental question. Chris, I wanted to go to you real quick. Do we have anything from viewers that you think is that we want to ask right now, or do you have any follow-up questions?
Yeah, I've got a follow-up comment and a question from the viewers as well. First of all, I just want to say, I had my own fairly profound experience in doing the psychedelic healing work. And as I started to share that with people that I felt were safe, it was amazing how many people would come out and open up about their own thing that they had just hidden away because it was not acceptable. So there is real power in something like that. And I keep thinking back to, the Me Too movement and when that happened and how much energy was released in there. And I'm kind of hoping we can get this trending that maybe we need a Me Woo movement for the UAP phenomena there, something like that. Or things like, decals we could put up for experiencer-friendly spaces for people that you can have a conversation with, and wondering what that might be like. Because I do think that stigma piece, that idea that you are experiencing something from outside of consensus reality is a huge impediment. I'm going to ask a related question, I think, to just very briefly for the panel to respond on, maybe in like 30 seconds or so each. This is from the chat. Do you feel that embracing this line of inquiry has had personal consequences for you, professionally, or for the academics academically? So I'll just let folks open up and answer that as they feel comfortable doing so. Feel free to chime in.
I'll touch
Anyone?
on it first. I'll
Bueller?
touch on it first. In the, I work in tech. I've not seen any negative consequences. I have a fiduciary responsibility to my investors. So obviously they don't want me out here whiling talking about who knows what. But I think partly because of my approach, that's not been a real issue amongst my social circle. I've not really had that problem. But I think that's also where we are in the conversation, that it's becoming less and less an issue. But there, I think, probably are specific areas like in academia where it's still probably pretty stringent.
So I've been pretty lucky on this, I think. So I thought getting into this was going to make trouble for me professionally as an academic, and it hasn't. In ways that I sort of expected my institution I teach for to look down on it. I actually found out recently that there were people that thought it was pretty cool. And so for me, entering into this arena has actually only opened more, at least it's opened more doors than it's closed, right? And but also once again, I'm in philosophy, so pretty no holds barred discipline there. There's a lot of people who believe a lot of weird stuff. So it's been easy for me. And in ways I was fully expecting that I had to like really keep the light under the bushel on this thing. But I think I overestimated how important that was. Yeah.
Jay or Kevin?
Yeah, I think I've had similar experiences. I expected that this would cause a great deal of trouble. When I got into it, I was already tenured. I was already a well-established scientist with an international reputation, so I think that helped a lot. But that's a lot to risk. So it really worried me at first. But I found that, my department and my university's been very supportive, which is excellent. And my colleagues have been supportive as well. I think that, and I think that it's helped to that as a physicist, I've focused on the nuts and bolts aspects of the problem. I think that the other weird, I don't like the word woo because it has all sorts of connotations that I don't think are fair, but the other strange things that happen to people who come close to these objects are interesting, and I think they should be studied too, but that's much harder to talk about.
Absolutely.
Can I follow up something with Kevin? Is that
Please. Yeah, please.
So Kevin, so you were tenured when you got into it, right? Same with me. And I was actually a full professor when I got into it. So I'm beyond the point of having to worry about a lot of institutional reward, right? Which is, and I think this is actually a problem though, for getting academics involved in it, because for untenured academics, or even people who haven't gotten their final promotion, even if they are tenured, if you're not publishing in certain types of journals and getting certain types of grants, that work will do nothing for you in your day job. It's going to essentially be a hobby, right? Which I think that's a problem, right? That's why I do think we need to, if we want young academics to get into this in both the humanities and in the sciences, I think we do need to have modes of publication, modes of academic expression for them that will count towards their tenure and promotion, right? Which that's pretty absent now, because like most people I know who work in this space in academia are tenured full professor types who have the leisure and can get away with a lot of stuff, or they're people who just never went the formal university route after getting their doctorates, right? And I do think maybe it's not as important to do that, but if we do want young academics to get into it as a major career interest, we're going to have to foster modes of expression for them that will actually count towards their promotion and tenure. Yeah.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. Yeah, I was tenured. I was not a full professor. I became full professor after I started studying this, which, in some ways surprised me. I counted that as a big win. But you're absolutely right. If you're a postdoc and you want to study this, that's extremely difficult. Where are you going to publish your work? And in one way, we're working hard. Some of us are working hard to get our papers published in mainstream scientific journals at this point. And the more we can do that, the better. And hopefully things will change. But but I think that's a big difficulty. How do you make the work that you do count toward your profession? So it's a big question.
And it's not where there's a conspiracy, like someone's working against us. It's just how the field works.
It's just how it works. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
I have a quick follow-up question for you guys. I mean, you guys are both instructors or professors, and you're well known for this work now. Are your students inspired by that? And if they are, what aspects in particular do they seem to be drawn to collectively? Is that anything that you can quantify? Kevin, we'll start with you, and then also Chris, I'd like to hear from you about that if you've had any experiences.
That's a really good question. That's difficult. I mean, we've had a few students who are interested in working with us and have worked with us a little bit, but I don't think that either I or my colleagues, Matthew Shadagas or Cecilia Levy, who are also studying UAPs at UAlbany, none of us are encouraging our students to do this. So if they're working with us to study the topic, I typically have them doing other things as well, like exoplanet research or something. So something that's more traditional, something that they can publish in traditional journals, something that can, help their career along, like we were discussing. So that's one way to, but then that means that UAPs are kind of a hobby for them, right? So it's very difficult. I find it hard to, in this climate, to support a student studying UAPs 100%, knowing that that's going to damage their careers. I'm, as a mentor, my job is to look out for their careers, and so I'm doing the best I can to make sure that they don't get derailed.
That says something right there, obviously. James, students, have they expressed interest to you, and what aspects are they drawn to of your work?
Yeah, so I taught a kind of upper level undergraduate course on the phenomenon, right? And it was funny, I didn't really tell the students that that's what we were going to do. It was a philosophy religion course, and they signed up for that. And then I sent them the syllabus and said, oh, by the way, greetings, Earthlings, you signed up for a course on the UFO. and a lot of them were sort of, what the hell have we gotten ourselves into? But I tell you, that course went off like a bomb for my students. And probably I think one of the most successful courses I taught to undergraduates here at Benedictine. And I think what got them wasn't necessarily they were interested in the intrinsic nature of the phenomenon. It was just, it gave them a sense of how far off common sense could be, how far off consensus reality could be from what's actually going on in the world. I think that really shocked them. Okay. And I don't think it shocked them into a kind of skepticism. I think it shocked them into a kind of like renewed wonder, right?
Exactly.
Like,
yes.
wow, if we've been really, really wrong about stuff. And I said, look, we were wrong about geocentrism, right? So, humanity's been really wrong before.
Lots of times. Yes.
Fundamental levels, at the levels of like basic empirical common sense. And if you're familiar with some of my work, that's a lot of what I'm doing with the phenomenon, is just show how it might not be surprising that we're surprised as we learn more about like what objects are and things like that. And I found that was what really, not necessarily what detracted from the course. What detracted from the course, I tricked them into it, right? Okay, but like what the staying power for them was that. And now though, I say at the college, it's sometimes hard for me to get through a class without talking about the UFO. The word's out there, man. This is the UFO guy at the college, right?
Yeah.
I always wanted to be that guy, actually, so that's kind of cool. And so now it's like students know that I've done stuff with this, and some of them have heard podcasts and stuff like that. So for me, it can be hard to to say, look, I'm just not doing that in this class, right? I've got other stuff I have to teach you, right? So I find with the youngsters, it's a pretty easy sell.
Yeah, I mean, real quick before we go to Chris, that whole reawakening of wonder, I mean, Jeff Kripal talks about the reenchantment of the universe and all of that, but that is the magical motivator that seems to infect a lot of people, for sure me, and I know Chris Avis as well, where it's like you become a unfillable hole of wonder, and you read things that you never thought you'd read, you explore ideas, and get to intellectual places that you've never been before, and it's all because of this burning curiosity that somehow rises out of, understanding that brilliant people take this phenomenon seriously and they have reason to. And it can be mind-blowing. Chris, I mean, I'm interested in what you have to say because you are also involved in sort of helping to improve curriculum at your school and organizing curriculum. Can you give us a sense of what's involved in shaping curriculum and from an institutional point of view? And if we were to like try to change the way that we approach certain subjects, that's not just something that's going to happen with the flip of a switch, right? That's a cultural and yeah.
It's a big question. I'll see if I can address it. I first want to respond to just like how have students or faculty or whatnot responded to this. And I'm major respect to people like James and Kevin for kind of taking the lead and going ahead on this. I'm still testing the waters very much with this, but where I have spoken about it with faculty that I feel are trustworthy is about my experience with kind of using psychedelics in a therapeutic setting there and what that did to my worldview, and very much having kind of a Jeff Kripal-esque flip moment. And you would be shocked how many people, even in the sciences, will kind of stop, kind of look around and go, okay, well, let me tell you about something that happened when my father died or what have you. And it's like, I'm a safe person, but they don't want to see anyone else doing this. So that stigma is alive and well. But the most amazing thing about this has been, in talking about this program that I was part of, which was very community focused, was about how much people are craving a sense of meaning and a sense of belonging, which I think has been kind of really dying out in the world. It's really a kind of a sense of nihilism with the modern world. I mean, folks are depressed, they're stressed out, and there's a sense that science kind of explains all of it, which is certainly not the case if you're actually doing research, but there are these things around the fringes which can lead to this sense of wonder that are kind of hidden outside of the bright light that we have there. And so I think even when you see faculty being interested in that, and also in that unifying sense that you get of the wonder of the mysterious, that there is actually real hope here for a way forward to help heal us. And this has led to actually developments of communities of practice for faculty and later for students around fostering community and the sense of belonging. So that aspect of it has been tremendously hopeful, which is why I really respond to what, Jay has talked about deepening relationships with folks. I think that's hugely important for what we need to do in this world phenomenon, quite independent. In terms of the phenomenon itself, I haven't spoken overtly with students about this myself, but a student asked me at 100% be honest with them about that. That says I'm testing the waters with things like, there's this news release out about the potential for having discovered Dyson spheres that came out earlier this week. These are these mechanical structures that would be built around stars. And suddenly you see people's eyes light up because there is hope that there might be something different and a reframing of where you are in the universe. So I will say that when the timing is right, students are hungry for this. The world is hungry for this kind of thing that can kind of really put us in our perspective there. Now, in terms of your comments about curriculum, the curriculum review process, at least at my institution, is about a year-long process, assuming you know what you're doing going in. It's quite lengthy to do that. It makes it challenging to respond. And I'm at a small community college. We're beholden by articulation to larger institutions. And so there's a lot of inertia there in terms of existing curriculum. And certainly in physics, there's your kind of standard first-year curriculum that nobody seems to deviate from. And it's basically from the 70s. It's outdated, doesn't allow for much time for exploration, but you're really looking at kind of an overturning of the field being required to do that. And I'm in part hopeful that this might happen, but for other reasons, in the sense that I think people are actually questioning the value of going to post-secondary, given what it costs and standards of living there. I think we're going to find dwindling enrollment. It's going to force people to actually go, we need to make this relevant to folks. And it might be through things like this, for people who are curious and hungry for an explanation for this weird and wonderful aspects of the world, that we find hooks to bring them back into traditional education. I just think it's going to require some pain on the part of institutions for them to actually be willing to do that. Or as someone pointed out in the chat, science sometimes evolves one funeral at a time. It may be time for, a real paradigm shift to come in place there. But you're starting to see it come in these related fields. I see a lot of this with, say, consciousness research, which seems very much related to that, where it looks like we're primed for a paradigm shift in a number of different areas. And maybe this thing will just kind of finally break open like the dam from one area, and that'll have a cascading effect from others. So I'm hopeful, but I'm also a little bit frustrated that it can't happen as quickly as I'd hope.
Yeah, we can hopefully look at it like a younger Dryas intellectually or something, right?
Exactly.
Knock down all the walls or whatever. To get back to Lester and Jay, one of the things that it seems like we go back and forth on is the status of the stigma. since 2017, a lot of us have been patting ourselves on the back saying, oh, we've made so much progress. The stigma is lessening. We can have these conversations. And that's true. I mean, obviously, I'm covering this as part of my TV station's, production resume. And that's significant from my perspective. And you guys are all making inroads as well. But at the same time, I feel like, Kevin talking about how I don't want to encourage young students to necessarily do this as their focus because that would ultimately damage their careers. That tells me that there is still really some significant hurdles for us to get through before this can even be an accepted or encouraged topic of discussion. But let's start with Jay and then Lester, if you can talk a little bit about the status of stigma as you see it and where it's holding your particular fields or silos back. Jay, we'll start with you.
Sure. And thank you so much, James. I guess when it comes to stigma, I mean, there's so much to say about the stigma. Mm-hmm. And some has already been said in this broadcast, and so much more has to be said for years. I guess one thing that I'm thinking about these days with regard to stigma, as someone who's working on a docuseries that's covering experience or cases in a general conversation about anomalous experiences. And even that, it's strange because anomalous experiences, it's a placeholder term in a way. It's a Band-Aid term because these are experiences. These are normal experiences, in fact. It shouldn't be so strange to say that. But if so many people over so many years in so many world cultures have these things happen to them, whether it's in my situation and with what I do, whether it's UAP, NHI, whether we're talking about near-death experiences, hauntings, whether you're talking about out-of-body experiences, the whole gamut, really, precognitive dreams. I mean, this is stuff that happens, it's stuff that people report, and they've been reporting it for thousands of years. So along those lines, when we're talking about stigma, one of the things that I see from a docuseries perspective is that we lose details that are embarrassing. We lose details that are embarrassing all the time. And when we're talking about those details that are embarrassing, they're often the high strangeness details. So, with UAP, for example, it's, people report, say, that it seemed like time slowed down. Or I went into the craft and it was bigger on the inside than it was on the outside. These are science problems, potentially. These are science issues. And if we don't have a basic understanding, if we don't have the reportage and we don't have the data about that, and if people aren't reporting it because it goes against our current understanding of science or our current understanding of reality, well, then we're going to continue missing basic aspects of reality and physics and many other fields, potentially for decades or centuries to come. And so rectifying that is incredibly important. Being able to get the details correctly, like in as much detail as possible. People have been editing things out for decades with this stuff. And they've done it well-intentioned. There were years in UFO reports where if you saw a being, then there's a lot of stigma there. There still is to a degree, but even among UFO groups going back years, if you saw an occupant, then that was considered like, oh. Or if somebody had an experience more than once, it was almost considered to be like, you throw them out automatically because it'd be like getting hit by lightning twice, right? How could that happen? But it does happen. It happens frequently that for whatever reason, somebody that has an anomalous experience is actually quite likely to have another.
Maybe the lightning's smart, right?
Yeah, maybe the lightning's smart. Yeah. And so along those lines, as far as the stigma goes, and as far as like advancing the conversation, we need those details so that we can even just understand, so that we can even understand the world that we live in.
Yeah, what people are actually experiencing, you know, I mean, and getting that in its entirety to be able to make a fair assessment of what's getting experienced, which I think we're still, like you said, because of the stigma, unable to quantify that a lot of the time. Lester, from your perspective, I think any kind of stigma is bad for politicians, right? Like, if you're automatically going to alienate, certain segments of the population, you're not going to want to go there. But I mean, there are a few folks who are willing to it seems like, to wade through that stigma and take a stand. But then there are senators who seem to take a stand and then back up, and I wonder if it's because of the stigma. Can you talk a little bit about how it plays into the, like we said, complexities of the political process and all the positioning that goes into that?
We are suffering from both cultural and bureaucratic inertia around this subject, right? And the challenge is that the political incentives are constantly in flux and are primarily based around fundraising or raising capital for your next election cycle. And then also, because we have our two-party system, the sort of whatever the top-down messaging is from party leadership. So as an example right now, with the upcoming election between both President Biden and former President Trump, what we've seen is, you know, historically in the last, let's say, 3 to 4 or 5 years, in the Senate side, we've seen Democrats be very serious, put forth very serious legislation, and also be willing to make public statements on the record that would probably raise a few people's eyebrows if they were to hear, you know, former Senate Majority Leader or someone like Martin Heinrich or Marco Rubio or what have you. So both Democrats and Republicans have been serious about it on the Senate side, but it's been interesting to see out of Democrats on that side of the equation. In the House, we mostly see it as a really Republican caucus and more of the freshmen as opposed to senior memberships. That's been the last 2 or 3 years. This year, right, particularly amongst leadership and from the Senate Democrats, at least in terms of their public statements and stances on this, they have taken several sort of steps back and are being a little bit more cagey. And this, for example, in terms of understanding the political dynamics, there is clearly a directive coming down from the Democrats that no one should bring up anything that's going to get Biden in hot water. We have enough to deal with. So bringing up this issue that's then going to be, for example, in the National Defense Authorization Act of reintroducing the UAP Disclosure Act is likely causing consternation amongst Democrats because they view themselves in a defensive position and they don't want to then have to talk about, you know, non-human intelligence in the middle of an election cycle. So it has been interesting to see the electoral politics impact this nascent sort of political movement, which has effectively had uninterrupted legislative success in every year that has happened since 2020. This was the first year where we're not seeing as much coming out of the House, not seeing as much coming out of the Senate yet. So that's been partly, I think, a dynamic. The other thing we have that's unfortunately an issue is that how the media landscape in politics works.
Absolutely.
And how ultimately, again, these algorithmic feeds, everyone's in their walled garden, they have one sense of the truth. And then so everything that's not in that consensus reality of your tribe is subsequently a conspiracy or whatever nonsense. So it's not even that there's a lot of times where people aren't even engaging with the substance of the actual issue, even if we don't have all the details that are important. They are just automatically saying, oh, that amendment has Schumer's name on it, Schumer's X, Y, or Z, and then they shut down and can't actually receive the information. So I think the information space makes it even more challenging to sort of get consensus in a political context because there are these knee-jerk reactions based on the characters that may be the messengers of the information.
Yeah, that's an important point, I think, and something I wrote about at one point on Medium was that there has been, for certain Democrats, and this gets to another question I was going to ask also, but that for some Democrats, you know, certain personalities on the right are anathema. So if whatever they come up with, they're going to classify it as a conspiracy theory or some nut story, and they're not going to focus, and they're going to basically have nothing to do with it. And that's gone on. I mean, when you have Congressman Burchett and others who are known by some on the left to be reactionary and to be, have been villainized, anything they say or anything that their groups of friends say, they're just going to reject out of hand, which is sad. But given that we live in the post-Trump age and all the things that have gone on over the past several years, I can see why some people have those feelings. It's an interesting development, and I don't know how we get out of that without there being some sort of, Deus ex machina from the sky to say, here's your spaceship, this is real, deal with it. All these. Go ahead.
I will say, if you look at the adoption of believing that UAP is a real thing and has national security implications, the amount of members in Congress who privately understand that to be true has increased and is continuing to increase. Now, there's a difference between privately feeling that way and being willing to take a public position or legislative stance to effectuate that personal reality that you have. And there's quite a few, and part of the reason for believing personally, but then not wanting to step out is what the point that you talked about. It's like, well, if I do this as a Democrat, I'm going to be associated with some of this stuff that's happening that people view as, not okay. So I do think the biggest challenge, but we've seen success, is distributing the amount of members that are in Congress, both in the House and Senate, that are willing to go on the record to say that they believe that this issue is a real issue and that it should be a part of the focus of Congress to address. And it could be from a number of angles. It could be from the aviation safety angle. It could be from some people who might be wanting to support whistleblowers or veterans who have had experiences with this issue. It doesn't necessarily have to be the craft and bodies conversation. And I think that's why we've tried to be pragmatic about understanding, okay, if they're on the transportation subcommittee, aviation safety is an angle that's going to resonate with them more than the testimony of David Grush. And it is okay to bifurcate the conversation based on the audience, because again, in our space, it's a goal-oriented, so you have to learn to be pragmatic and not idealistic, because that's not just the way things work in the US Congress anymore.
Well, and I think that there's no other way to get about it. I mean, when you have the left and right, they each want to, the arguments that they'll accept to take action are going to be dramatically different. I mean, there might be Democrats who have a deep suspicion of any military-industrial complex corporation, and so they're going to immediately be more skeptical of anything those kinds of companies say, and so that may be the way in. Whereas for somebody else, skeptical of governments, big governments from the right, a different argument is necessary. But that, does that discourage the kind of cohesion that we're trying to encourage here?
It does.
Yeah.
It does, because you don't want to go tell the Republican Party, hey, a great angle for the deep state argument that you all have pushed for all these years is the crash vehicle program that Biden's running. Yeah. That's not where we want the conversation to go. And I do give a lot of members credit that I think many people recognize that this is beyond politics. I do think that there is that realization. They're still political animals, so they have to get out of those habits. But I do think there is a not insignificant group within Congress that are also bringing more people in the fold that want to keep this non or bipartisan.
Chris, did you have any follow-ups or any viewer questions?
I do have a follow-up here. I wonder what we should make of the fact that the mainstream media is just not covering this at all, even from like a ridicule angle. One of the pieces that I really thought would have been ripe for that was, in the waning days of that Schumer amendment, you had Senator Schumer and Senator Rounds holding a colloquy on the floor of the Senate talking about this. And how do you not even touch that, not in a kind of like an X-Files theme playing out way? And I wonder, how do we address that? Because it means that this gets covered in the fringes. And I think, sometimes this is great coverage, sometimes it's not. But the other problem that this arises from this is that, this also tends to get wrapped up in other kinds of conspiracy theories and conspiratorial thinking. And so we're asking folks to accept things which seem outside of their normal news sources and their normal frame of reality. How do we get them to accept it? And then how do we distinguish ourselves from other, conspiratorial thinking that maybe has less of a factual basis? So I don't have an answer for that. That's maybe a big question, but I wondered if I could get some of the panelists there to briefly respond on that.
Jay, you want to give it a shot?
Oh,
anyone?
was that me?
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
I said Jay, yeah. Anybody
Okay.
else too?
Yeah, maybe somebody else should go first.
All
Then
right.
I'll go.
Kevin. James.
Yeah. I mean, Chris, I think it's a really good question. It's one I struggle with. Okay, so I don't really know how to answer it. So I'm going to kind of just share the question, right? Because
that's good.
This is a problem because I often put it this way: is as soon as you admit that there's something to the phenomenon and you connect it historically to earlier things like what went on in the 40s and the 50s, then you're officially a conspiracy theorist, right? Like you have to say, right? You know what I mean? That there's been some kind of cover up going on with this, right? And then once you do that, then I think you've got to worry, then how do we like separate this from other like plainly paranoid modes of thought, right? I personally find once I've done that, I've lost my prima facie winnowing fork on doing that, right? Because I'm admitting that on this issue, it does seem like something has gone on to systematically deceive, and I would go Kennedy too, but like to systematically deceive, yeah, the population. Okay, then all right, but then what keeps me from going all the way down like a QAnon rabbit hole in this thing? Do you see what I mean? Okay, and that's a worry. I think that's a real worry. Okay.
Absolutely.
And I think all we can do is like to say like this is wherein education and critical thinking comes in. Okay, because we do have to like be very scrupulous about demanding evidence about all this stuff. We have to be very scrupulous in demanding rigorous thinking about this stuff, right? We can't just say if it's UAP, then it's in because we're basically convinced of the reality of the phenomena, right? Like you can be convinced of the reality of the phenomena and still believe that 99% of what you hear about it is complete bunk, right? Which is probably true. Okay. You see what I mean? So I think we have to like be rigorously self-critical, both of ourselves personally and as a movement, right? Like rigorously self-critical to like constantly be asking ourselves, are we falling into a potential paranoia that could come along with this, right? And I think that's very, very important.
Yeah, Kevin, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, this is a difficult problem. And I think I've encountered it in a slightly different way in that one of the first things I did was publish a peer-reviewed scientific paper on estimates of UAP speeds and accelerations. And that got a good bit of attention from the scientific community in that I was contacted by a number of scientists who found it compelling and then wanted to get involved. So it did a lot of good that way. It didn't receive any press, really, which, I'm a scientist, so that's fine with me. But what was a bit more disturbing was that, one positive thing, there was a report written for the Begin Sadat Center in Israel, where the Israeli military referenced my paper in several places and noted specifically that the speeds and accelerations are consistent with what you would expect for an interstellar spacecraft. And meanwhile, Aero didn't acknowledge this paper at all. We actually met with Aero. They had a copy of the paper. And when questioned by Senator Gillibrand as to whether they had any knowledge of scientifically peer-reviewed published papers suggesting that this might be non-human, they said no. The recent report from NASA, which supposedly was a literature search on the topic, also doesn't include this. So it's being ignored by our government. The Israelis picked up on it, but our government didn't. So either our government's not doing its job or they're keeping something quiet, but I can't say that because then I become a conspiracy theorist again, right? However, the fact is that these speeds and accelerations have been known since 1954. Hermann Oberth, who was a rocketry pioneer, German rocketry rocketry pioneer. He was the mentor for Wernher von Braun, gave a talk on UFOs in 1954. And he mentioned in his talk that these things have been recorded by over 50 radar measurements that he had seen to be moving at speeds of 19 kilometers a second, which is on the order of 40,000 miles an hour. This is 1954. We've known about this. Some people have known about this since the 1950s, known that these things move as fast as spacecraft move. The New Horizons probe that flew past Pluto and is currently on the outer edge of the solar system is now traveling 45,000 miles an hour. That's how fast we track UFOs at. Why isn't this news? And why isn't our government paying attention? Why isn't NASA paying attention? What's happening? I don't know what's happening. This is why I keep working and hoping to get more data, more information, publish more papers, hoping it'll make a difference. But something is amiss, and I don't quite know what it is.
Yeah.
Dr. Knuth, I love your quote from your Soul talk last November. Why do we call them spacecraft? Because they move faster than our spacecraft do. And it's just so on its, that talk was fantastic.
Hey, real quick, Kevin, can I get your reaction to your, I mean, the government knows this, someone knows this, that we have these craft that are moving at these speeds, and yet we've been, advocating for the government to release whatever information it has for generations, and I don't know that we're really any closer to having that fact happen. Gary Nolan offered up the idea of having sort of a civilian crash task force, or something that people could, scientists could run that aren't associated with the military industrial or the espionage complex. Do you think that's realistic, and how do you think that could work? I mean, is it something that you've given any thought to?
Well, I think scientists getting involved in any aspect of this problem is going to help. I mean, it'll help open things up. So but the fact that this isn't getting attention is very strange.
Seems like it's endemic at a certain point. Chris, did you have any viewer questions that we could go to real quick?
I think we're good at the moment, but we'll go on to your next one, and then we'll see what comes up that aligns.
Okay. Real quick, I wanted to ask about different kinds of, evidence that we're all interested in looking at and analyzing, and either if it's for, from the political perspective, help shaping and giving an argument that'll sway people. If you're a scientist, it's something that obviously you base your whole mode of thinking upon. Can you each talk a little bit about what kinds of evidence from your perspective do the most good, and how people can, or which direction people should sort of push themselves if they're trying to help generate evidence that can move the argument? Start with you again, Kevin.
Yeah, I think that the discussion on speeds and accelerations is helpful. That really, I first worked on that topic because when I became interested in studying UFOs, I thought, well, how anomalous are these things really? Let's put some numbers on how anomalous these things are. And I went for speeds and accelerations because that was the easiest thing to compute. However, we do have some data on automobiles shutting down and restarting when UFOs leave. That can now give us some handle on how strong the electric fields are around these UFOs. They seem to have very strong electric fields and very strong magnetic fields. These are things we can measure, and having groups out there like UAPX, the Galileo project, IFEX in Germany, and out with equipment to try to detect these things and measure some of these quantities is very helpful. So I think that's something that can, you can really put your finger on and quantitatively say how anomalous these things are. That I think is useful. I think that the one thing that really stirred me, and I hesitate suggesting this because I don't want to, I think it's a little dangerous to look at these things as a threat. I think that'll be way too easy to do, and I think we'll jump to that because that's what we tend to do as humans. But the report that the SCU put out on the incursions of UFOs at nuclear weapon sites and nuclear weapon facilities back in the 1940s is really compelling. There's a lot of information there. It's a big report. And what they found statistically was that UFOs were frequenting construction sites that were being constructed to refine uranium and produce it for nuclear weapons. At a statistically significant level, they were actually coming to visit these places. So how did they know? I mean, clearly there has been a pattern of surveillance and monitoring on the behalf of the UFOs. These things are clearly intelligent. They're clearly watching us, and that's what that document. When you read through it, that's the impression that you really get. Now the danger is that makes you paranoid, but I think it's probably the strongest evidence we have in some ways that these things are intelligent and advanced.
Jay, for you, I mean, it's interesting from an experiencer's perspective. I imagine that a lot of time anecdotal evidence is what's given. Not always, of course. There's always objective things that people can show or share with folks to help prove that what they experienced actually happened. But what is the place of anecdotal evidence? And I mean, to my mind, it seems that there's certainly value in collecting people's experiences and collating them and looking for patterns, maybe eventually an AI algorithm that can go through those things. But before we get to that point, what can we do, and what role should anecdotal evidence play, I guess, in our thinking about all of this?
Well, I think in physics, it doesn't really play much of a role. I think that's where it becomes difficult.
Sure.
I think it plays a role in other aspects of, I mean, the whole world doesn't revolve around physics like some people in my department might imagine. But but I think in real life, the anecdotal evidence is important. I mean, I watched recently when I gave my talk at the Soul Foundation, I had referenced a little clip of from Close Encounters of the Third Kind, where Richard Dreyfuss's truck gets shut down by the UFO and then restarts, and I discussed that in some detail at that conference in my talk. But watching that clip, I mean, all of the effects that happen in that truck, I mean, they don't all happen during an experience, but they've all been reported, and that's really pretty fantastic when you think about it. And watching that now, knowing a lot more about what has been reported. I see how dead on Steven Spielberg was in that movie, which is really pretty surprising.
Yeah. Jay, do you want to take a shot at that?
Sure. Yeah. And to Kevin's point, along with what you're saying in terms of anecdotal accounts and whatnot, Jacques Vallée, of course, famously consulted on Close Encounters of the Third Kind. And I think one of the main reasons that Close Encounters of the Third Kind still resonates with the impact that it does is that he got the details right, like Kevin's saying. And that's because Jacques delivered, the appropriate details that were delivered to him by the experiencers themselves. And so, we can look at kind of like, big data models like you were mentioning, James, and things along those lines. But when it comes down to it, the anecdotal accounts, there are so many situations where those details again matter. And I just keep banging that drum, but it's important. There are many group sightings. It's important to recognize that a lot of encounters with UAP and even NHI happen when groups of people are driving in their automobiles. I mean, this goes back to Betty and Barney Hill and even before that. And, some of the cases in Bud Hopkins' classic Missing Time, you get at situations like that. Group encounters, like there's a reason why the Ariel 1994 encounter is one of the most famous on record, because of the sheer number of children that encountered these NHI. So along those details, when we start to compare and contrast what we see there in terms of from the perspective of the recipients, those details matter. There are details that, for example, like John Mack would write down in terms of what tools were used by some of these NHI in interpersonal encounters and things like that, that eventually became a bit of a standard with him in terms of corroborating accounts, right? And so once we go along those lines, and then we start to see that there are situations like Ariel where some of the kids would report things a little bit differently, right? And so what does that say? And is that, a problem of individual perception and memory and, reports that way? Yeah, that can be the case. And then there are other situations where people will have a very interpersonal exchange right in front of them, two people, they'll see something completely differently. And that seems to be a situation, maybe, where some of these NHI or some of this phenomena is actually able to hack our perception. This is something that James Madden, for example, and others have covered quite extensively, and I think is a fantastic, topic to consider in the years ahead in terms of how we're dealing with this phenomena and also dealing with the peculiarities. In that, like, some debunkers and some people that can be excessively negative about this phenomena will, chortle at somebody saying like, oh, somebody saw a bipedal wolf or something that presented as a clown, or all of these situations where, all the other bells and whistles read as a UAP or an NHI encounter. But if these beings or this intelligence can actually hack our perception and is interested in staying quiet or staying a mystery, then maybe we should look past some of those physical descriptions and get at the deeper details.
Yeah, absolutely. And James, Professor Madden, I was hoping to come to you a little bit for a deeper dive into some philosophy, I guess. We in the sciences, or people in the sciences, and in our society in general, we kind of have an obsession with what we call objective knowledge, right? Like somehow there's a kind of knowledge that's outside of us and it's verifiable and it's something concrete. And then there's the subjective inner experience. But I mean, there's, I think, debates that go on about how truly subjective anything truly is or how objective anything truly is. And your book about hyperobjects, I think, does a great job of sort of alerting your readers to the fact that there are things above us and below us that go in directions that we are totally unaware of, and they could be having whole existences that we are, aware of, privy to, or have any awareness of, I guess. So can you talk a little bit about how that fits in with, anecdotal evidence and how that may, inform whether or not we easily dismiss someone else's experience when we haven't had that experience ourselves?
Yeah, so I appreciate that. So first, I think we have to, and this is really what I try to do in my thought about this, my writing about it, is we have to understand like we're going to need to revisit what we know about how perception works, about how human minds work, right? In as much as because we're going to have to at some point try to winnow out like what is it that we're bringing to this experience and what is this thing bringing to it?
Absolutely.
Right?
Yep.
So there's going to have to be this kind of like, I call it hermeneutics of subtraction at some point. Like what is our own human attempt to understand something that we probably were not evolved to understand, and thereby we're throwing up our own signal on it to get a grasp on it, right? And to do that, we have to get very clear on what is the human signal that gets thrown up, right? Okay, and we have to do this kind of like subtraction from that. Okay. And so and I think wait a minute, so let me just leave that aside for a second and I'll come back to it. And also like, okay, in terms of anecdotal evidence, right? At some point, I think we have to get beyond just trying to establish that there is such a phenomenon.
Yeah.
I mean, I think we need people right now, especially this moment, doing the kind of work that Keith's doing, right? To like to establish that there is an objective thing going on here, that there are things doing 40,000 miles an hour in our atmosphere and things like that.
Yeah.
Okay. But then I think, so we start out with is there such a thing question? Okay. But then I think the question's got to shift to, okay, but what does it mean for us to have discovered that? Or what might this thing be trying to tell us? Okay. And once we realize like that kind of question's in play, then the anecdotal evidence is going to become very, very important.
Yeah.
And maybe already is, right? Because it's then we have to look at, like, so, okay, we established that there is such a thing. Okay. Okay, given that. Now, what does it mean? What might it try to be? What might it be trying to tell us? Right? Like, what difference should it make for us? Like what is our history with it? Those all now are going to become questions that we're only going to make progress on by going to experiencers and trying to figure out, winnow wheat from chaff there, right? Figure out like what structures can we find within these anecdotes that make them non-anecdotal, because we can see a structure across them, et cetera, right? And this is to say, like, we're just practicing disciplines now, like phenomenology, like psychoanalysis, like hermeneutics, right? But that's built on anecdotes, that there's no controlled experiment we can do there, right? We're going to have to like look at and analyze, right? And so I think these are not inconsistent projects, like the analysis of the subjective and the establishment of the objective, right? I think they're parallel projects, and I think the more that they're successful, the more they're mutually supporting, right? The more we can make sense of it being a fact, of an established scientific fact, and the more we can make sense of what it means existentially, the more both claims become plausible. So I don't see it as like a zero-sum game between humanities and sciences on this or really anything else.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that that's important to say. And like with Jeffrey Kripal's work as well, where he's kind of sort of trying to bring, the different colleges together to have a, constructive conversation around a very complicated topic. I applaud that deeply. Did you have something to say, Kevin?
Yeah, I wanted to jump in here for a second. I'd like to quote a good friend of mine, and he says that he says, "I am sufficiently intelligent that I can learn from anyone." And I think that that's really a wonderful quote in many, many ways. And this is how I feel about anecdotal evidence. There's something to learn there, certainly. And even though I'm a physicist, I can still learn something from it. And I think that we should keep that in mind. And I think that there's two things to consider here. One is my PhD work was actually studying periodic stimulation of the auditory cortex in the human brain, measuring it with magnetic fields. But I studied brain stimulation, right? Did neuroscience work as a PhD student in physics. And one of the things that I learned was that stimulating the brain with visual flashes at 12 hertz will resonate with your algorithms. And actually, we now know this can cause seizures. This is why you get the big notice when you're playing PlayStation. This is flashing lights. It can cause seizures, right? So one thing we do know about some measurements of electric fields around UFOs is that there are cases where people have measured very strong electric fields oscillating at 12 hertz, which is the frequency of the algorithm, which is the frequency of the light flashing that can cause seizures and cause brain, things happening with your mind. And so it could very well be that being close to some of these objects can mess with your perception. And it can explain why people forget that it happened, don't think to take out their phone, don't think to take a picture, can't take a picture. I know somebody who tried taking a picture and was physically unable, and all sorts of strange stories like this. So there could be a physiological reasons for why what's going on is going on. And
lost time probably too, right?
And could be lost time too. So the anecdotal evidence could be very important in understanding some of the effects on our physiology. But then on top of that is that if we're dealing with an intelligence, then intelligences interact with other intelligences. So if you want to learn about the intelligence, you need to talk to the other intelligent beings that interacted with it. And that requires looking at the anecdotal evidence. So I think it's very important.
Absolutely, yeah. And Lester, you were not. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, James.
Yeah, I think this goes to an interesting question I've always had about the scientific study of the phenomenon. Kevin, is when you're doing physics research normally, you don't have to deal with the possibility that, say, like the photons are trying to outsmart you, right? Okay. Whereas with this, it may be the case that what you're studying is actually smarter than you are and is trying to outsmart you, right? So then it's sort of like, how do you even deal with that experimentally when the very thing that you're studying may be like screwing around with the variables, right? It seems then that like whatever we're doing, like the normal scientific method is going to have a kind of limitation here if we do come to the conclusion that this indeed is smart and smarter than us and may have every reason to be monkeying with our very ability to study it, right?
Yeah, that's a great example, and at the Soul Foundation conference, I talked about luminosities of some of these UFOs, and these things they can put out hundreds of megawatts of light. Why would anybody need hundreds of megawatts of light? It doesn't make any sense. And I brought that question up at the Soul Foundation meeting, and I was going to see Dune 2 with my friend Dave Greenwood down the street. And Dave had just seen my talk, and he said that he was thinking about that. And he said that the only reason he could think of why you would need such bright lights is so that nobody could take pictures of you. So they couldn't get detailed photographs. And when he said that, it was like, of course, that's the only reason you would need bright lights. You can't get photographs of these things. So the way I put it now is, they want to be seen, but they don't want to be observed.
Yeah.
And that really made a lot of sense to me. And it seems to fit with their whole modus operandi, right? They want to be seen, but they don't want to be observed. Yeah. And I think that's my new quote. So feel free to use it, because I think that's what's going on in this case. But that's where the intelligence comes in, right? And that this is where anecdotal evidence is going to be important here.
And this puts you in an utterly novel situation as a scientist, right? And that you're, in a way, playing chess with the phenomenon that you're studying in a way that no other scientist is, right?
Right, exactly. Yeah.
That's pretty fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, maybe Coco the gorilla knew how to play chess. I'm not sure, but maybe.
Yeah.
Imagine if Coco was trying to outsmart the people that were studying it, right?
Yeah. She probably wouldn't have had much luck.
Very difficult situation.
Well, and the other interesting thing about that is that we need to understand the anecdotal evidence if we're going to understand what potentially the motive is of whatever this other is, because that impact is being engineered, it seems like, and if it's being engineered, then there's a motive behind it, and that gives you a glimpse into sort of what the overall purpose may be. But unless you take the anecdotal evidence and people's stories and experiences seriously, you're never going to be able to get into that information. And even still, it seems to me it's heavily encoded, half metaphorical, archetypal, all these different like psychological ways of applying pressure to get us to do something, but that something is as yet undefined. And I know it sounds like a science fiction novel or almost like a paranoid, sci-fi movie or something, but that seems to clearly be the case. Chris, do we have any viewer questions from folks?
We do, and just recognizing that we're kind of coming up towards 6 o'clock Pacific here, this is actually a question I think we'll have some interesting discussion and might be a good kind of a wrap-up question. Good. This is coming in from the chat from Kelly Chase, who will be joining us, of course, on a later panel. And I think it's a great question. The question is, what was something that has surprised you about the phenomenon that changed how you viewed the topic? And I'll take a first stab at it myself. When I first looked at it, I looked at it through the lens of the extraterrestrial hypothesis, and also didn't really pay too much credence to the high strangeness aspect of it. So seeing the modern discourse about the phenomenon really heavily intersect with this consciousness aspect, and what Jay was kind of talking about this thing being able potentially to hack our consciousness, has suddenly made that a much more interesting way of looking at the phenomenon for me. It's led me down the rabbit hole of kind of looking into what John Keel and Jacques Vallée would look at with this kind of control system hypotheses, and the fact that this phenomenon seemingly mimics where we are in different historical time periods, but maybe is a decade or two ahead of where we seem to be. And it's maybe asked those kind of questions, even if this is technological rather than something else, what kind of technology could be doing that? And I think looking at those pieces that don't seem to fit into a purely physical box, at least in terms of how we understand science right now, opens up a whole pile of interesting questions, even from a purely scientific perspective. How is this possible? What is this telling us about our biology and about science, that where we can have some fruitful areas of research? So that's my take on that, and I will pass it to the panel because I think we're going to get some great responses here.
Could you restate the question real quick, just so it's fresh in
You got it,
everybody's minds?
yeah. What is something that has surprised you about the phenomenon that has changed how you view the topic?
Lester, let's start with you.
This is such a good question because I could probably come up with a million things. It's kind of hard to come up with on the spot, but maybe two examples was one, my uncle who's an engineer. We were at a funeral and we were kind of just commiserating, etc. And I had not yet told my family that I was in the subject and having a public facing sort of profile. So I didn't really understand how my very hard sciences family was going to engage, just receive it. I ended up getting a sighting story from multiple of my family members during the Samora Machel plane crash. I think it was 1986 when they're in Zimbabwe. And we obviously have a history with the subject with aerial school. And so it all kind of connected in a way that made me feel so much more connected to my home and family. And that was kind of a weird thing. So that's the personal one. And then probably the more abstract one is when Rizvark from MIT taught correlated simulation theory to UAP in terms of explaining the apparent sort of how they can materialize or dematerialize without necessarily going to a location, and using the idea that video games procedurally generate. And if you expand that out to like the universal framework, that's an interesting way to think about what possibilities now exist if you take the mechanics of like what you think of video game engines like Unreal Engine 5, and just like, okay, well, if this is Unreal Engine 5, what's possible then? So I think those are probably the two, a personal and a different way of having me think about the subject.
Excellent. Jay, do you want to start?
Sure. Yeah, this might seem a little bit out there, but in terms of talking about the high strangeness aspects and, looking again at other people that have been mentioned, like John Keel or Valet or Sharon Hewitt-Rowlett, who I mentioned earlier, or Mike Cleland, both of whom have written very, very well on high strangeness effects and what people think of as synchronicities. And they both have huge case histories of things that seem highly, highly, highly improbable with regard to people seeming to have like a strange feedback with the environment that they're encountering. And I think that's one thing there, is that one of the things that I'm thinking about recently in recent years, high strangeness has this like absurd quality. Like Jacques Vallée used to talk about it, and still does, in terms of like that it's a grand absurdity, and that maybe the point of it is to be absurd in a way, those kinds of synchronicities. And at the same time, I think that we might be seeing a phenomenon where there's a more large scale feedback apparatus of like localized space-time or the environment in a broader way than we're willing to accept at our current juncture. And I think it's a fascinating thing to think about.
Very quickly, if I can just jump in on that, Jay, I think that's also, synchronicities are a really interesting way of getting people interested in this whole topic, because most people can think of at least one thing in their life where they've had that, even if it's not as exotic. And that's, yeah, so I'm really keen to explore that more. Thank you for that.
Yeah, I wanted to also interject real quick. Mike Cleland, who you were mentioning there, I had him on Neon Galactic at one point, and I read his book, and the day he was to be on my show, I went on a walk, on my little 10-minute walk around the woods. And of course, I round a corner, and there's a woman in front of me, and she's all, "Look over in the woods, there's an owl." So of course I turn and look, and there's a gigantic owl sitting there staring at me. If you know Cleland's work, he focuses, or at least partially, on how the owls interact with the phenomenon and whatnot. And a later discussion with him, during the interview, he's like, "You don't know how many times podcasters have said to me that when we have our interview that just today I saw an owl." I don't know what to do with that. but it felt important to me, and it left me kind of like shaken a little bit, and I couldn't look at my surroundings the same way ever again, and that's lingered with me, and that's the way the phenomenon, I think, has sort of driven me to be more driven in research and everything else. Jay, did you have something you wanted to add?
Yeah, just very quickly. I remember hanging out with Mike Cleland at the first Archives of the Impossible conference and kind of walking around the Rice campus with him. And of course, Rice University's mascot is an owl, so that's a completely inappropriate environment to explore the owl connection.
Yeah.
However, I did recognize with him, just walking around with him, there's kind of this strange idea that and I find it to be true, like Mike Cleland, like synchronicities almost attract themselves to him.
Yeah.
There's this idea that when you look at the phenomena, it looks back at you, right? I mean, this is kind of a truism, and I find that to be incredibly true with Mike with regard to synchronicities. If you've never really recognized a synchronicity happening around you, all you need to do is handcuff yourself to Mike Cleland and like go for a walk for a couple hours. No pressure, Mike, but yeah, you'll see them for sure.
Yeah. James, did you want to give that question a shot?
Yeah, and of course now the owls outside my house are freaking out. Yeah, just no joke. I think for me, I'm not an experiencer, outside of like some synchronicities and stuff like that, but I think that's true of humans, right? But the thing that is kind of impressed me most with the phenomena since I got into this is meeting experiencers. Okay. Especially, in going to Jay's conference last December and then like some of the people I met when we taped some segments for the Beyond, the documentary that Jay's working on. It's one thing to read about this stuff. It's another thing to meet what are clearly sane people who are like, and I don't mean to make it like this like bourgeois thing, but like successful professionals and stuff like that who are like, this happened to me, man, and I'm not backing off it. It happened, right? And have very intricate stories that are verifiable from other people in their lives and stuff like that. I think actually meeting people like that is pretty mind-blowing, because it becomes, even if you were inclined to take this seriously, it goes from just like, yeah, I don't think I can rule it out, evidence is pretty good, to like, I'm one remove from it now, just in having met that person, right? And when you meet someone who does strike you as completely sane, completely reliable, who's a little like, gosh, if I had it back, I wish it hadn't happened, right? And all that, right? Not grifting on it and that sort of thing. I think that's kind of a game changer in terms of the plausibility for it.
Yeah. Real quick on that, Diana Pasulka's work is exactly that. And that's what moved me so much when I first read her book to fall into this topic, is that the best and brightest minds in the world are people who have these experiences. And the evidence that they bring back from those experiences informs their innovation. That blows my mind. I don't know how you can look at that evidence and think, well, something's not going on here that is, helping people transcend their normal intellectual limits. And what does that mean? Kevin, did you have a response to that?
Yeah, there's a lot to think about here. The whole, and I think, Jay, you put it best. When you look at the phenomenon, it looks back at you. That appears to be true. And again, people are uncomfortable about going into details, as certainly am I. And so I won't go into details, but I've experienced this in many ways at this point. A simple one, I can quick give you an anecdote. We were filming a Terror in the Sky. We were doing the pickup shots, and we were going to do the pickup shots with William Shatner in Burbank. And I flew into LAX and had an Uber driver taking me up to Burbank. So we're in traffic for 2 hours or something, hour and a half or something like this, and chatting away. And he wanted to know why I was there, and I told him I was filming a UFO documentary and going to meet William Shatner. I was very excited about this, and to preface the rest of the story, I had already known about a case, a potential landing case in Mexico, where it said that the UFO was found just parked there, doors open, keys in the ignition, and the Americans got there before the Mexicans did, and we got it. I had heard this story previously. So I'm chatting with the Uber driver, who's a nice young Mexican guy, and he said, from Mexico originally, and he says, yeah, my father was a general in the Mexican army, and he had clearance, and he used to tell me all sorts of amazing stories. And he said he told me about this UFO that had landed in Chihuahua, and they had sent a team out to go recover it. And there was one guy on radio that was parked some distance away, and the rest of the team actually went on the ship, and then subsequently died. And so they called for help. The Mexicans didn't know what to do, so they called the Americans to come in and take the craft, and the Americans did. And so he tells me this whole story. And all I could think was, like, how is it that I'm in an Uber driving to film a UFO documentary, and I happen to have that the Uber driver is the son of a Mexican general with clearance who knows about this UFO recovery that I had heard about, right? I mean, it's a crazy, crazy synchronicity. But these things happen, and they're amazing when they do. But so looking into the phenomena, having it look back at you is one of the most shocking things. And the fact that UFOs are related to the phenomenon in the first place is very strange. It makes you really question something as simple as the extraterrestrial hypothesis. And so I really have to agree with Jacques Vallée on this. The extraterrestrial hypothesis is not going to be sufficient here, it seems. And so that to me is shocking. The second thing that's shocking is when you do talk to experiencers, especially those who've had, encounters with the so-called gray aliens with the big eyes, and they take eggs and sperm from them, and are later introduced to, or given babies to hold. 60% of them are given babies to hold. When I heard John Mack say that, I thought, wait a minute, this isn't made up. If you've got 60% of these independent people telling you that they have a medical procedure done and they take eggs and sperm and then they're given babies, what's going on here? And the fact that some of these babies appear to be hybrids, not entirely human, is a big problem, because you can't hybridize between species. You can't, if they're extraterrestrial from another planet, they probably don't even have DNA. And if they had DNA, that would be amazing. And that would be a discovery in itself, right? But even if they had DNA, they'd be as distant from us as a mushroom is from me in the backyard.
Absolutely.
Right. So there's no way you're going to hybridize. And so the fact that so if they are actually hybridizing like this, if this anecdote is really real, if this pans out, then they have to be human. And then what? Where do we go from there? I mean, this leads to Michael Masters' ideas that they're time travelers. That's a little creepy, because that's what humans look like in the future. I don't know about that. That freaks me out a little. But,
me too.
But whatever. But there's a lot to worry about here. This is clearly a very complicated situation. We've got many, many, many discoveries to make here. And there are potentially many, many secrets that have been discovered already that people might want to cover up. I mean, a lot of this might be incredibly uncomfortable in many ways. And that, I think, is what surprised me more than anything getting into this.
That's a great point. And I remember during my most recent interview with Jeffrey Kripal, he talked about that after we lift all the masks and get through all the BS, ultimately we're probably going to find out somehow that what's underneath the alien suit is us in some form or another. And I think that helps to spur the curiosity even more, the enchantment. We have about 90 seconds left, so I guess that's about it. I wanted to ask Chris, did you have any final words? I do want to say thank you to our great panelists for a fantastic conversation. It was wonderful, and I hope to talk to you all again. And we'll have another one of these panels shortly. But Chris, did you have any final words you wanted to share?
Yeah, I just want to thank the panelists. This was phenomenal. It was exactly what we were looking for with this initial discussion. So thank you all. I'm really honored to be part of this. And I also want to thank our audience. There's been a great little side conversation going on there on YouTube. And for any of our panelists, there's been a few questions we haven't been able to get to. I'd encourage you to have a look at that chat. I think there's some great ideas for future discourse. So great community around this show. Thank you all for joining us tonight.
Yeah, and real quick, I wanted to make one final point, and this is self-serving, so I'm just going to go ahead and do it. Please subscribe to the channel. Please like this video. We talk a lot about wanting to get mainstream media to cover this stuff. They'll cover it if they see that there's an audience for it. And I don't care what they think about it. They won't care what they think about it if there's an audience who shows up when they air that stuff. And the more seriously the audience takes it, the more serious the networks and everyone else will take it. So the way that you encourage that is by patronizing people in the customer sense, patronizing people who make that content. Thank you guys very much. I appreciate you, and hopefully we'll talk again soon.
Thank you.
Bye, folks.
Thank you, guys.